Thank you. I'm actually going to start not with broadband, but with a story of telephone service. Some of you may remember back in 2012 when Hurricane Sandy swept through that it knocked out phone lines, entire networks in entire areas, and one of the places where it was knocked out was Fire Island. Huge portions of the network were simply washed away. And in May of 2013, Verizon decided that they were not going to go to the expense of rebuilding a wireline network. They had a cellular network. They had a device called VoiceLink, which would plug your house into the cellular network. It's true that you would lose a lot of functions that way. You would lose, if you were dependent on it, 911 accuracy, and who needs 911 accuracy? You would lose quality of voice because God knows, if you're older or whatever, it's not like you need to be able to hear anything that people are saying. And Verizon, though, figured that what the heck, 80% of the traffic coming off, the voice traffic coming off the island was already on their cell network. What was going to be the harm? True, Verizon had to get permission from the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, and the New York Public Service Commission because this was still a regulated service. But come on, let's be honest. When was the last time anybody expected the New York Public Service Commission or the FCC to deny Verizon anything they really wanted? Instead of a cakewalk, however, a firestorm erupted. We had all 500 permanent residents of Fire Island writing in to the New York Public Service Commission and to the FCC, and they were angry. And more than that, they were telling us really important things that were riding on that phone network that everybody thought was obsolete. Businesses absolutely depended upon these to do credit card reading, to do ATMs. You needed them to run the fire alarm in your kid's elementary school, which plugged directly into the wireline phone network. The mayor and the fire department declared this was unsafe. We had one guy who said, I have a pacemaker. I used to be able to just hold the phone up to my chest, and have the hospital monitor it. Now I need a 4-hour drive twice a week in order to have the hospital monitor it because the cell phone network won't cover it. More to the point, people were angry. They kept saying, this is America, not some third world country, and most importantly, this is a public utility. You can't do this. And in fact, as the firestorm spread, we started to get national coverage. We got little towns, some of the most Republican places in New York State, writing preemptively into those bureaucrats in Albany and New York City at the Public Service Commission, saying to them, please spare us from the free market. Regulate this thing and make it give us the service we need because that is essential to our lives. Who ever thought they would see that? Government turned out to be the solution, not the problem after all. We no longer remember what an amazing and progressive innovation the concept of public utility was. We think it has something to do with natural monopoly, but that's not the actual story. Really, this was a fantastic innovation of the first progressive movement after the Civil War, which recognized that certain services were too critical to be left to corporate power. Like antitrust, public utility became a necessary means of limiting corporate power over the essential services in our lives. AT&T became a monopoly not because it was a natural monopoly and that's why we had to regulate it, but because AT&T engaged in an active campaign in the first part of the 20th century to be a monopoly, and the only way they could do that was to make the case that that was how to provide the utility service. AT&T advertised one policy, one system, universal service. That was their slogan. Biggest company in the United States was saying, please regulate me as a public utility so I can be a monopoly. Times have changed. Nowhere has this basic principle been more essential, the idea that there's an essential service that matters in our lives than in communications. This goes back to the Constitution, where we embedded this in the power of Congress to create postal roads and a postal service. As the authors of the Constitution said in Federalist number 42, nothing that facilitates intercourse between the states can be deemed unworthy of the public care. As communications evolved, we took this principle with us. We moved it from the post office to the telegraph to the telephone, and now we have to ask the question, are we going to move it to the broadband internet? We know that at every stage that we have jumped up the technology on these communications essential services, we have enabled new forms of civic engagement and business to the benefit of everyone. Abraham Lincoln became a national candidate because the Telegraph distributed the transcripts of his debates with Douglas. Sears Roebuck revolutionized commerce and brought luxuries and industrial goods to rural areas that could never have seen them before by leveraging the power of the Postal Service for the catalog, the train network for the delivery of goods, and the telephone network for dial ordering. Martin Luther King famously leveraged the national radio and television networks to push for social change. Which brings me back to Fire Island and the internet. Consider all of the things that ran on that network. Health and safety services, all retail services, basic communications. It intruded into everything. And why? Because we had a principle of public utility. The principle of public utility works in a virtuous cycle. When something becomes critical to our lives and commerce, it becomes, to use the language of old statutes governing such things, affected with the public interest. The law recognizes a special status by requiring that these essential services be offered in an affordable, dependable, reliable way to all without favoritism or discrimination. This, in turn, allows everyone else to find new uses no one ever imagined. Bring in reliable, clean water, and you not only get drinkable water and basic sanitation, but also breweries, restaurants, and other businesses. Bring in electricity, and you get entire new industries and devices that run on the electricity. Bring in an open communication network, that most basic function of human beings after survival, our desire to communicate with each other, and magic happens. If it's open, available, affordable, and ubiquitous to all. Critically, so the people of Fire Island weren't stupid to think they could depend on this. Verizon spent a lot of time, and their corporate cheerleaders spent a lot of time saying, oh, those moochers on Fire Island. How dare they rely on this thing as if they had a right to? They did have a right to. That is what 100 years of law said. Yes, you have a right here. It is more important than Verizon's ability to make money. It is more important than the fact that, yeah, they paid money to pull out the wire, and I know they got all kinds of benefits for it too, but I'm not even talking about the quid pro quo. Even if they had paid for everything, it's too bad for them. Because as we have said time and again, certain services are so important, we cannot leave them to the benevolence of corporations, the kindness of kings, or the cold indifference of the market. We must guarantee fair access for all under a rule of law. That is what a free society is about. So what ultimately happened on Fire Island? Well, good news. Because the company needed permission and created this opportunity for people to rally to it, we were able to force Verizon to give up on deploying VoiceLink. Within 3 months, they went from it is impossible, impractical, and unduly expensive to deploy a wireline network on Fire Island to, yeah, we're going to give you Fios. Fiber to the home, the upgrade to the essential service of the 21st century, because this is a utility. This is an essential service, and we migrated all of those things that people were using the phone network for to the fiber network, again, amping up their power 100-fold to do new things through that essential service. That is what public utility means. Now, you may think, okay, who could disagree with that? Ultimately, it turns out to be well, but it turns out the very concept of public utility now is under attack. We see things that we never thought we would see. We see people being deprived by water privatization in Detroit of the water they need to live. We see our electric grid crumbling and being essentially privatized by telling people, well, rather than rely on that electric grid, why don't you go buy yourself a generator at Costco if you can afford it? We have seen this repeatedly in the area of communications, and I'll give you the counterexample to what happened in New York, because it happened right across the border in New Jersey. They had a town that was also had their network wiped out on barrier islands. The Broadband Public Utility Commission told the FCC, don't worry, don't you do anything until we've had a hearing, and we've set up a process, which they never did. The New Jersey Broadband Public Utility, the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities has essentially been in Verizon's pocket. It has renewed Verizon's franchise despite evidence that there are towns in New Jersey, and we're talking about towns that are an hour away from Comcast headquarters in Philadelphia, an hour and a half away from Verizon headquarters in Basking Ridge, and not only do they not have fiber, not only do they not have broadband, because nobody wants to bother to put up the towers for reliable wireless, what they have is the leftovers from the last time we had public utility. A rotting system of copper that New Jersey, the state, doesn't bother to force them to keep up. One of the towns, I was reading about this, actually had to send notes home with the school kids to their parents to ask them to call into or write into the New Jersey Board of Public Utility because they had no other way to communicate with each other. That's what happens when you don't have public utility. On Fire Island, standing on the right and the rule of law, we upgrade this to the essential service. Across the river, where they don't believe in public utility anymore, where we have moved to this idea that it's actually just the guys who own and build the networks ought to be able to decide it like with any other good, we're slipping back. You can't even get a phone signal reliably anymore in some of these places. And we're not talking about, out there somewhere. In the 20th century, our boast was we put a phone on every farm, and our telephone network was the envy of the world. And now, in a deregulated environment, you can't get broadband an hour and a half drive out of Manhattan. What does that tell us? This is a public utility. This is the essential service. And it also tells us why our opponents are so desperate to degrade the idea of public utility, to degrade the notion when we talk about these things. And believe me, some of their discussion points are just crazy. You listen to the National Cable Telecommunications Association, and they're saying, well, look at roads, they have potholes. That shows you public utilities are bad. I'm like, so you're saying we shouldn't have roads? No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying public utility bad, and it's a mantra. Public utility old, public utility bad, government problem, not the solution. You heard before about the problem of people being depowered. That didn't happen by accident. It didn't happen overnight. It is a deliberate strategy of the last 40 years into which those who narrow interests that benefit from it have poured what essentially amount to unlimited resources into getting people to believe that government cannot help them, that they should be powerless, and that they should be dependent on not a rule of law that treats all equally, but instead on the benevolence of corporations, the kindness of kings, or the cold indifference of the market. Replacing a rule of law with, if I may quote from the Declaration of Independence, a tyranny unfit for a free people. I want to conclude, because I know I'm over time. I just want to conclude with the thought that this battle here is beginning. If I can make a historic analogy, and we think back now and look at World War II, we see by the end of 1942 was a critical turning point. Some of the biggest and most important battles that had stopped what had seemed to be an unstoppable wave of darkness coming out of fascist countries with the seemingly endless resources and military power were concluded by the end of 1942. The Battle of El Alamein, which stopped German advance in North Africa. The Battle of Midway, which stopped the Japanese advance in the Pacific. The Battle of Stalingrad, which stopped the German advance into Russia. But nobody imagined at the end of 1942 that the war was over. But what they knew was that for the first time, they had proof we can win. We can turn this around. And that is what we have now. When we won the net neutrality fight, when we got the federal government to tell Comcast and Time Warner Cable, the most powerful companies, frankly, not only in the United States, but practically in the world, that no, we're not going to grant you your merger, that was our Midway. That was our El Alamein. That was our Stalingrad. We have turned the tide, but we have very far to go. I don't say this with the hope that you all will drop what you're doing and join our fight, because everything that everybody is doing here are all fronts in this same war. This war, as we've heard repeatedly, to make the tech something that embodies our fundamental values, to make it an expression of who we are and who we have been. But all of this sits on the idea of an essential service, the powerful platform that we just heard about that drives this. And I'll conclude now with a line from one of my favorite movies from the World War II era, "Welcome back to the fight. I know this time our side will win." Thank you.